Good afternoon. My name is Anne Marie Schneider. I work with the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research, the sponsor of the forum today. The Institute is directed by Doug Roberts, who will be joining us shortly. The Institute is also the home of the State of the State survey. Perhaps you've heard about that. It's the quarterly opinion survey that's taken across Michigan. And you can actually, you as individuals or as members of your office, can sponsor questions on the State of the State survey. So I don't know if you knew that, but it's kind of a fun thing to watch after. And if you have an issue that you're following, you're interested in getting the public's opinion on that issue, you're welcome to be a part of the State of the State survey. IPPSR is also the home to the Michigan Political Leadership Program. I see some graduates or participants in that program in our audience. That is for people who are interested in becoming more involved in the policy discussion, perhaps as an elected official. And then the Institute also supports the Legislative Leadership Program, which is a policy orientation program for new legislators, and I see a few graduates of that program also. In addition to that, one more thing, we sponsor the Michigan Applied Public Policy Grant Program, and that is a program that has provided more than $3 million to faculty on campus to work with not only within their discipline with other faculty members, but we really favor those proposals that we get that engage practitioners like you. So if there is, again, an issue that you're looking at and you're working with a faculty member, perhaps the MAPR grant funding would be something you'd want to look into. So welcome. You took a break from all that sunshine and decided to join us today for just what I see, and I'm sure you see, as such an important conversation and educational opportunity. So that's what the Institute is all about, the policy research and education. We want to provide sound information that will resolve some common myths about the accused and also the incarcerated today. Our topic is mental health and crime. So the conversation that led you here today was brought about because of what seems like a surge of violent crimes committed by many whose mental state might be in question. So addressing this topic today is Cheryl Kubiak. Dr. Kubiak is a professor in the College of Social Science in the Department of Social Work at Michigan State. Her interests engage criminal justice, the mental health system, and substance abuse. She's been a consultant for federal, state, and local entities interested in improving service delivery for those with substance abuse and or mental health disorders. Her priority has been to get individuals with serious mental illness actually diverted from jail or prison whenever possible, wherever possible. So she'll talk about mental health screening in jails, mental health courts statewide, diversion programs. She was recently appointed by the governor to the Criminal Justice Policy Commission. And the mandate of this commission is to reform around criminal legal policy reform that includes sentencing as well as options for diversion. Congratulations, Dr. Kubiak. That's a wonderful appointment. You'll have an opportunity to make a big difference there. So she'll give us an overview on this topic. Dr. Shields will then speak. She's to my right. She'll speak with us about people who become defendants and then are referred for evaluation. So she'll also look at how Michigan's process might differ from other jurisdictions. Candace Shields is a clinical psychologist. She works at the Center for Forensic Psychiatry in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and serves as the center's assistant director and heads evaluation services. That's a role she's held for about 6 years. She previously worked as the director of the work therapy program in Ann Arbor's VA Medical Center, and prior to that, as a psychologist in the Wyoming State Hospital. Her education includes time at Western Michigan University, Chapel Hill at the University of North Carolina, and then her doctorate degree from the University of Louisville. That's right, you are a Cardinal. I'm a Cardinal as well.
Excellent. No cards.
L, yes. Then speaking before we open up for discussion will be Lois DeMott. Ms. DeMott is a longtime advocate for mentally ill who have entered into the criminal justice system. She began her work when her mentally ill 15-year-old son was incarcerated and placed in the adult correction system. In 2011, Lois co-founded a statewide family-led organization named the Citizens for Prison Reform. Her family story has been told by the Detroit Free Press and also in the NBC documentary with Ted Koppel. Lois worked for the Association for Children's Mental Health up until last year, and that is when she was awarded a May 2014 Soros, am I saying that correct? Soros Justice Fellowship. So she currently spends her time developing the family participation program as a Soros Justice Fellow. She's going to talk with us about her family's journey and about the family participation program, which is intended to help the families of loved ones who are incarcerated. Our panelists will take questions following all of their presentations. And if you have a question, you have a comment, you have some input you'd like to give, you'll need a microphone because we are filming so that we can put this on YouTube and we can extend our public education effort past this room. So raise your hand and we'll bring the mic over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am really happy to be here and really happy to spend 15 minutes talking about my life's work. So I've been involved in this long before I became an academic and started when I was actually a nurse back in some of the old state hospitals that are now closed. So I began the journey there, went from there to some work administering a diversion alternative program for women who were involved in the criminal justice system, and then decided I needed a lot more information to figure out the solutions. So went back to school and have been an academic for the last 15 years with a focus really strongly in this area. So I want to start by just providing a little bit of clarity around the terms, because I think what gets confusing is we all see a lot of statistics and sometimes they don't make sense because we'll see 60% here, 40% here, and it's a little bit distracting trying to figure out what the real picture is. So I wanted to talk a little bit about when we discuss mental health and mental illness, it's really a continuum. So all of us who have what we consider mental health may be suffering some depressive symptoms from time to time, some anxiety, but it doesn't interfere with our daily functioning. When we cross that continuum into mental illness, there is some impairment in our functioning so that we can't go to work or we can't maintain our self-care. When we get into serious mental illness, that's kind of the category that we most often hear about of folks who are either incarcerated or institutionalized. So when we talk about mental illness in the criminal justice system, we have to think about how it's measured, how mental illness is measured. Are we talking about a mental health problem? Are we talking about serious mental illness? We have to think about when it was measured. Some of the statistics going back to the early 1990s have much lower rates of mental illness among those who were involved in the criminal justice system. But we also have to think about the sites. Was the mental illness measured or the mental health problem measured when someone entered a jail situation or a prison situation? So over time, we see increasing rates of mental health problems. By site, we see that jails generally have a higher proportion of individuals entering with a mental health problem, and I think that's due to the revolving nature of the jail population. And when we talk about measures, one of the biggest and most widely quoted studies is the high end of the spectrum here that says 64% of persons in jails or prisons have a mental health problem or illness. That's done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but in that they used the definition of mental health problem as anyone who has certain symptoms or had a mental health treatment by a professional in the year before the incarceration. That's at the very high end. If we go to define mental illness as severe and persistent mental illness, which is usually the eligibility for getting community mental health services, or serious mental illness, that figure drops. And that figure nationally is about 15% roughly. And again, it depends on what tool is being used. But when we talk about serious mental illness, about 15 to 18% of those who enter jails or prison have a serious mental illness. So what are some other important considerations when we talk about mental illness? And that is, one is co-occurring disorders. Co-occurring primarily with a substance use disorder. And about, of those who have a mental health problem, 75% are going to have a co-occurring substance use disorder. And what does that mean? It means to practitioners around the state, it's much harder to treat. There are many less experts in the area of treating dual disorders because best practices say you should treat them together simultaneously. So that's a real important consideration. The other consideration is that prisons or in jails, any confinement can actually exacerbate mental health symptoms. It can also create new traumatic experiences that can create mental health problems. So this idea of locking someone up so that they get better is not always the case. And partly this is because medications change. If someone is stable on medications in the community and they get put into a confinement setting, the formularies may be different, so you may not be able to get on the same medication that you were on in the community. And that instability through a medication change is often very problematic. Also, when you think about individuals who have mental illness, a lot of stimulation can create escalations in behavior because they're very sensitive to loud noises, bright lights. And so when we think about prisons and jails, that's the type of environment we see. The other thing is assaults. Physical assaults, sexual assaults during incarceration exacerbate mental illness and create new mental illness. What's happening here? Is this a system failure, or are individuals just becoming more mentally unstable? And so when we think about law enforcement intervening with mental illness, it's become a system failure, and it's a symptom of a system failure. And that many causal kind of mechanisms might have led us to this point. Of the deinstitutionalization that was found few community resources, also funding declines. The Baselin Center estimates that currently we have 12% of the funding for mental health that we had in 1955. We also have a system that treats more from a crisis standpoint, and service mechanisms and funding mechanisms that fund at a crisis point rather than a preventative point. And I'll give you one example. In-reach into jails and prisons. If someone is on your caseload in community mental health, has ended up in a jail, we know that the best thing we can do is try to get them into treatment when they get out. And doing that usually means in-reach, of making connections while someone is still incarcerated. Because for any of us, getting to that appointment to see a mental health professional is a difficult one. And if you know the person, chances are that you will be more likely to make that appointment in the community. Those in-reach sessions are not funded by Medicaid because it takes place in a confined setting. So it discourages community mental health workers to make those kind of important preventative practices work. I just copied this slide from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it's an interesting slide because it just shows you a time kind of series of state hospital patients in the red versus mentally ill prisoners in the blue. So you can see over time how the number of state hospital patients has declined while the number of mentally ill prisoners has increased. So I think it's a powerful slide to kind of depict the problem. What other things to consider? Well, the cost of mental health treatment within prisons and jails is much more expensive than community-based treatments. Alternatives that provide treatment and support in the community can be provided without increasing the risk to public safety through higher criminal recidivism. And I also want to make this point that not all criminal activity among those with mental illness is attributable to their mental illness. All right? There are some other social conditions, like many prisoners or detainees in jails and prisons, that may be the catalyst for criminal behavior. So what do we do about this? This is a model for prevention and intervention that says at the earliest points in the process, how do we divert people from the criminal justice system? So this sequential intercept model is becoming very popular within our state and across the country. And it is basically a flow chart that charts from a law enforcement contact at the top here, through the courts, through into jails, and then jail reentry or state prison. So saying that along this continuum, there are many points where we can make an intervention that can be preventative. I handed out a model that has much more information on it, that provides you some information about what the different interventions at each one of these intercepts can be. But the goals of sequential intercept are to envision these series of intercepts along the way at which interventions can take place that prevent entry or further penetration into the criminal justice system of a person who has a mental health disorder. These sequential intercept models demand collaboration between law enforcement, courts, the criminal justice, corrections or sheriffs, as well as the treatment providers in the community. And it's a beautiful thing to see this kind of collaboration happening all over the state. So I want to talk a little bit about that. The sequential intercepts, some Michigan examples. The first is the Governor's Diversion Council that's been in effect for the last few years. And Stephen Mays is in the audience, is the liaison to that program. You might want to talk with him more about it. But it is a series of pilot projects that are starting around the state with the overall goal to reduce the number of individuals with serious mental illness within jails. The pilots currently are primarily along Intercept 1, which is the law enforcement intercept. So we see many of primarily sheriffs and local police departments engaging in CIT training around the state that actually gives officers skills regarding de-escalation and community services that are alternatives to taking someone to a jail. When I've talked with some of the law enforcement officers around the state who say mental health issues are their number one concern, I also say that they don't receive this kind of training in the academy. They don't know how to de-escalate a situation, and that some of the behaviors that they have learned in the academy actually escalate the behavior of someone with a serious mental illness. The other intercept that we're seeing some of the pilots on are what's called post-booking diversion. So someone comes into the jail and is booked into the jail, but are diverted outside of the jail into alternative community placements, or Intercept 4, which are jail services, so providing services to someone when they are in the jail or as they are entering the community to prevent them from cycling back into the jail. I'm currently involved in evaluating those programs, and hopefully we'll have some results for you next year. Mental health courts are another intercept that occur at the courts. And so this model is similar to drug courts, where individuals who have a diagnosed mental health disorder are diverted from jail through a program, a structured program that runs through the courts, where the judge supervises the treatment and through monthly meetings with the individual, and there's a team of professionals, usually mental health professionals, substance abuse professionals, around the individual. So in Michigan, there were some pilots that were funded in 2009 by a combination of the State Court Administrator's Office and the Michigan Department of Community Health. And there was an evaluation of pilots in 8 counties, and then a long-term evaluation in Wayne County. I'm going to just give you a few results of those 2 evaluation projects. So in the statewide mental health court evaluation, it was 8 courts in these counties: Berrien, Genesee, Jackson, Livingston, Oakland, Grand Traverse, St. Clair, and Wayne. And there were 678 individuals who entered the mental health courts between 2009 and 2011. And the population of these courts differed from 22 was the population in the lowest court to 166 in the most populated court. And the average age of individuals was 35. The evaluation designed for this looked at comparing the 12 months before they entered mental health court to the 12 months after mental health court. And the time during mental health court varied between 12 and 18 months across the state. But the evaluation mostly is a pre-post. So I wanted to show you high-intensity treatment in the mental health community is community that psychiatric hospitalization, very expensive treatment. So before mental health court, this bottom line, pre-mental health court, about 31% of individuals had psychiatric hospitalization within the year before mental health court. And you can see that the year after mental health court is much lower. It's about 15%. So that it dropped considerably in that year. Jail days also in the pre-period were quite a bit more, almost 39 days compared with 23 days. And when we look at the successful versus the unsuccessful folks in mental health court, we still see, even if someone has not successfully completed the program, that there is a treatment effect, that they actually spend less days. Here are the unsuccessful participants who had about 55 days before and 48 days in jail after, compared to the successful group that had 24 days before and less than a day after. This slide is here just to show you that one of the findings that we had, like I said in the beginning, is that those with co-occurring substance use disorders proved to be less successful, and that was a predictor of successful outcomes. The Wayne County Mental Health Court evaluation was a long-term evaluation that we did between 2009 and 2014. And why I bring that to you is because the last phase of that evaluation was a cost-benefit analysis. And so we looked at comparing a group of folks who were eligible to enter the mental health court but were rejected for some reason, or did not choose to enter. And we compared them with folks who were successful and unsuccessful, and on a number of different outcomes: mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, but also new criminal activity. So these are the figures I'm going to show you, that when compared to that group that did not enter mental health court. The successful participants in mental health court in a one-year time period saved $914,000, but the unsuccessful group also had a cost saving of about $503,000. So quite a significant savings overall for a limited number of individuals. It was 106 individuals here. So I've also included some references here at the back and some resources. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm Dr. Candace Shields, and I'm going to be talking to you about the Center for Forensic Psychiatry. I want to take a poll up front. How many people have heard of us? Excellent. Okay. Most of the people in the room. Usually if you're watching the 6 o'clock news, you're going to hear about us because someone's being sent for a psychiatric evaluation after allegedly committing some crime. That's us. They're being sent to us. So as Dr. Kubiak talked about places in the INTERCEPT model, we are at the pre-trial phase of that model where someone has been arrested, charged with a crime, and we're doing the evaluations for the state mainly for pre-trial competence to stand trial, and also our insanity evaluations, whether or not someone's has a defense of being not guilty by reason of insanity. Before I get into that, also just to let you know, Anne Marie had spoke about some things that I have done. My journey, I was born and raised here in Michigan, and of course did my undergrad at Western Michigan, go Broncos, and then went away to other states, getting more training, more schooling, specialized training, both in the federal system doing these types of evaluations and in other states, the state of Wyoming. Who here has heard of the state of Wyoming? Less people than have heard of the Center for Forensic Psychiatry. Great. So I will try to throw in some comparisons as if I can, if I have time, to how things are done in those jurisdictions, how they might be similar or different. So I'll do that along the way. The Center for Forensic Psychiatry, we exist by law. We were established, I say we, but I've only been there for the last 6 years, but I'm happy to be living my dream, doing what I want to do back here in this great state. So I'll take it all in. Established in 1966 by the legislation, a recommendation by a special task force in the Department of Mental Health. It's the state's sole certified forensic center. We service all 83 counties. So if someone needs an evaluation within the court system for pretrial competency evaluations or sanity evaluations, they are coming to us, and I'll talk more about how that happens. We have a new hospital, and on the first slide, we always have a rainbow over the Forensic Center. This is our new hospital. It's a very nice facility. That was occupied in 2005, so we just had our 10-year anniversary just about a month ago. We had some pizza. We are a 210-bed psychiatric facility. Our primary services are twofold: evaluation services to the criminal justice system, and also psychiatric treatment for defendants who are adjudicated incompetent to stand trial or not guilty by reason of insanity. Our mission is to provide quality forensic mental health services to individuals in the Michigan court system. Our client, I'll just tell you, our client is the court. Okay? We are treating individuals and persons with mental illness, but our client is the court. We have two major divisions at the Forensic Center. One is evaluation services. Ms. Snyder told you I am an assistant director of evaluation services. That's your first stop when you come to the Forensic Center. It's an entire unit with kind of special not really special rooms, but interview rooms with special security measures. The Sheriff's Department will bring defendants from the county jails to us, and we will evaluate individuals during the day, during the week, and then they're returned to jail after our evaluation that day. We also bring patients from our in-house units down if we need to do further assessment with someone who might be on one of our treatment units. So our other major division is clinical or treatment services. So let's talk about evaluation services. Said a little bit about this. All 83 counties are served. We conduct evaluations for the district and circuit criminal court systems in the state of Michigan. Evaluations are conducted pursuant to statutory requirements in Michigan law. So you're going to hear me talk about 3 key words: mental condition, mental illness, and intellectual disability. And Dr. Kubiak talked about mental illness and how it's utilized in the work that she does. Mental illness is actually defined by law for me when I'm doing these types of evaluations, so I'll get into that a little bit more. All evaluations are ordered by the court. We're the first stop. If you want one of these evaluations, if an attorney or the judge themselves motions for these types of evaluations, they come to the Forensic Center. Defendants can get a second opinion or an independent medical evaluation. Maybe you've heard that on the news or in the media. Those are done after they've come through the Forensic Center. Examinees are typically adults. However, we do evaluate some minors who are charged with adult crimes. Evaluation referral questions, the big 2, competence to stand trial, legal insanity, call it criminal. You'll hear me say legal sanity, legal insanity, criminal responsibility, not guilty by reason of insanity. All kind of the same thing. Less frequently, we'll evaluate a defendant for whether or not they're competent to waive counsel, competent to proceed pro se, whether that's the same thing, represent themselves in court, competence to be sentenced, or other special diagnostic questions. We have 4 domains of defendants that we serve on the evaluation unit. First, bond defendants, custody defendants, what we call out-county defendants, I'll get into that, and we also see some defendants who are coming to us from the Michigan Department of Corrections. So bond defendants are required to get themselves to the Forensic Center for their evaluation. So they'll bring, even if they're up in, say, Ontonagon, they're required to transport themselves down if they're out on bond. Custody defendants are brought in by sheriff's deputies from most counties. And I'll talk about now our out-county defendants. They are seen, we have a few satellite facilities, and that's on the next slide, so I'll get into that in a minute. And then if a prisoner has now been charged with a new offense while in prison, assaulting a correctional officer or something to that effect, they also may be referred for these types of evaluations, so they will also be brought to the Forensic Center by correctional officers for evaluation. So our satellite facilities, we have 4. Kent County Jail. We actually have an evaluator on site over in Grand Rapids who sees individuals at the Kent County Jail, and once a month we send out evaluators for a week at a time to do evaluations there to capture some of the counties over on the west side of the state. It's more economic, so to send us over there, and we rotate doing that, than to have all those counties coming to us, and we're able to do that. We also have a site at the Grand Traverse County Jail, same thing. We don't have someone established there, but we send out a forensic psychologist or 2 each month, depending on the cases that are coming in, and kind of capture that northwest corner of the state. So that those sheriff's deputies aren't having to bring those defendants down to us. It's quite a drive. Also, let's talk about Marquette. Marquette, our satellite facility there, captures the entire Upper Peninsula. Can you imagine if sheriff's deputy had to drive down that defendant? Well, it's going to take 2 deputies, number 1, that one defendant to come down from Ontonagon. We also have a couple of evaluators who are primarily doing evaluations down at the Wayne County Jail. Wayne County, our biggest customer, so we see a lot of people not only down there with our 2 evaluators that we send there, but we also bring many defendants in from the Wayne County Jail to be seen at the Forensic Center. Evaluation services, we're doing evaluations. We provide opinions to the court. We don't make recommendations at evaluation services for any sort of treatment, and the final adjudication comes down from what we would say is the trier of fact. In competence hearings, it's going to be the judge. For a trial where someone's putting forth a defense of insanity, it's either going to be the judge or the jury. We offer opinions on these questions that have been referred to us. We do not make the final determination. So if someone is adjudicated incompetent to stand trial, what we do, if we opine that, we do make a recommendation of where they go. And some of those cases come to the Forensic Center. So we treat individuals who are at the Forensic Center because they've been adjudicated incompetent to stand trial. And also, in the state of Michigan, if someone has a successful defense of insanity, they are required by law to come back to the Forensic Center for at least 60 days. I'm not telling you anything that's a big secret. You can go look this up online. They have to come in for 60 days for a diagnostic evaluation. Of course, there's evaluations after that, and we make recommendations to the court about whether or not a person, the mental illness that they have has ameliorated, or they're no longer a danger to the public. So they periodically get those. And then there's determinations they either stay at the Forensic Center or they may be stepped down to area psychiatric hospitals or community placements. So that's a whole other discussion on that. But these defendants who have been adjudicated legally insane could end up actually not incarcerated, but in a treatment facility or at the Forensic Center much longer than any sentence that they might have been handed down. And that's because their release is dependent upon their mental health, amelioration of that mental illness, and or their dangerousness to society or the general public. So we have 7 inpatient units. We have 2 male admission units. We have 1 admission and treatment unit for women. We have 1 unit for women. Most of our patients at the Forensic Center are men, and statistically, that fits. And then we have 4 intensive treatment units, and those are all male. So, 4 plus 1 plus 2 is 7. I did that math last night to make sure I had it right. Treatment units are staffed by psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, rec therapists, occupational therapists, music therapists, forensic security assistants, and registered nurses. Actually, our nursing department is our largest department at the Forensic Center. And this brings to mind just a fun fact. I've worked in the federal system and out in the state of Wyoming, and I do a lot of work with some national colleagues who are in the same specialty. We are the largest conglomerate of forensic psychologists in the nation. We are a very centralized, certified forensic facility. Other states, some states do it very differently. I don't believe, this is just from my kind of knowledge at the moment, there is another state or jurisdiction, I know the federal government doesn't do this, that has one centralized location where they do all of their forensic work. I think we're it in the state of Michigan. Off the top of my head, I know that Ohio has kind of 10 divisions of forensic facilities. When I was out in Wyoming, we didn't have a certified forensic facility. We had a forensic unit in the state's only psychiatric hospital. So that's how it was done there. And in the federal system, there are institutions that have inpatient psychiatric facilities, some major ones, about 5 of them. I'm very familiar with 2 of them where they literally have to ship their defendants to those facilities for these evaluations. So when someone is on one of our treatment units, they are getting person-centered treatment planning, where the patients and the treatment team work together to develop an individualized treatment plan. I am here to tell you that at that point, if someone's incompetent to stand trial, yes, we're treating them for their mental illness, but the overarching goal at this point is to restore their competency. And when we do restore that competency, they're either going back out on bond to await the next step in their process, or they're being returned to jail if they're in custody. So that's what happens there. Our programmatic activities take place on the unit. It's a locked facility, but you can earn privileges and then get to come out on our main street. It's a fabulous place. It's got all of these different rooms. We have a library, a gym, multi-purpose room, music therapy. We have a greenhouse, all sorts of different domains and activities. Of course, we also have therapeutic groups. And the 2 kind of camps, some of the groups done by psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers are going to have some overlap, group therapy as to understanding one's mental illness, but we're also going to have kind of breakout groups, those who are there for the purpose of being restored to competence. So we have an incompetent or a competency restoration group versus a breakout group for those who are there to understand the process of being adjudicated not guilty by reason of insanity. Here are some numbers. Competence to stand trial. Here's what we're up to. I know that looks very busy, but just look over. Oh, I got the pointer. Yay. Just look over here. For the last 6 years, these are total opinions rendered at the Forensic Center. Almost 12,000 opinions were rendered. 20% of those were incompetent to stand trial. And you can see that over the last 6 years, that's been consistent and steady. Comparatively, we are in keeping with kind of national statistics on that. A 1991 meta-analysis found a base rate for finding or opinions of incompetency at 30.6%. Like, well, you know, Candace, that's higher. But that involved only 27 studies. We get more studies in 2011. Now we have 59 studies, and the base rate for incompetency is 27.5 based on a meta-analysis of those studies. So we're right in there with national numbers. Here's some numbers on our opinions rendered on criminal responsibility. Over the last 6 years, we've rendered a total of about 8,500, and our breakout numbers, our opinions that someone's legally insane, 11%, and not legally insane, 90%. So as you can see already, there's not a lot of opinions being rendered that someone has a defense for legal insanity, and I'm going to show you how that looks overall. From 2009 to 2013, there were 1.2 million arrests of adults that are persons 17 and older in Michigan. During that same period, about 7,800 of those, less than 1% of those arrested were evaluated for criminal responsibility. That is legal insanity. Of that, 298 cases resulted in successful adjudications of not guilty by reason of insanity, 3.8%. So overall, 0.02% of the arrests in that time period in the state of Michigan resulted in a legal ruling that someone was not guilty by reason of insanity. So approximately 2 successful adjudications for every 10,000 arrests. So contrary, I think, to some public opinion that this is very successful a lot of the time, because guess what? We hear about those cases. Those are the ones that are put out on the news or that we see. It is very low and very difficult. Just to let you know, every state and the federal jurisdiction has a statute for competent to stand trial. 47 states and the federal system has statutory provisions for criminal responsibility. 3 states have abolished the insanity defense: Utah, Idaho, and Montana. Okay, so they do some things differently there. We are in keeping with this broader jurisdiction. I'm going to leave you with that we're in keeping with this broader jurisdictional finding of how our opinions and our adjudications come down on insanity. Broader estimates from jurisdictions, and this was done back in 2007, indicate that 0.1% of felony cases involve a plea of insanity. And of those, only about a quarter are successful or result in a successful adjudication. So about 2.5 out of 10,000, okay? So we're right there with kind of larger jurisdictional findings. Some contact information for me. Thank you all.
I am Lois DeMott, and I'm going to share today not only some of my personal journey, but some of the journey of others that I have seen and experienced as we entered through this system. You have to understand that I was a medical transcriptionist. I used to think you do the crime, you do the time. I had no clue what went on inside of our prison system, and I really didn't care. All I knew is that I was safe from the criminals who were locked up until my son entered the system and my eyes were open wide, and that has now become my work and my deepest passion is caring for these families and these people who are on the inside. So I'm going to share just a few little pieces from my son's story because I see that you all didn't bring your sleeping bags today, and there are so many vitally important pieces to his story that I'm not going to be able to share today because of the time and stories of others. But this is my son, Kevin, and I think that every story that you hear, every family has their significant experiences that have led them down the road of ending up in the system of incarceration. For my son, we saw at the ages of 3 and 4 that he had emotional impairments, and we started seeking help, seeking treatment, evaluations, and more kinds of treatment. And so it was a very early onset that we recognized this. And you can see as well, often you hear that the people inside were living lives of crime or in drug homes or on the streets. And our story happened to be different. We had very wonderful opportunities for our children as they were growing up, and the family vacations and the sporting events and all of the things that you had to partake in, you would consider our family to be a normal middle-class family. By the time that he was 9 years old, he had started coming up missing and was running away, and we started seeing more and more odd behaviors. By the time he was 11, we had tried allowing him to move out with family out of home. He had been in the detention facility for a stay. He'd had an inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. He was diagnosed as bipolar at the age of 11, and he had been placed out of state in 2 residential facilities. We then became involved with our community mental health, and they recommended that we start calling the police because they said that the court system had the funding to get us the services that he needed. What we didn't know was the enmeshment that would occur once he got involved in the court system. At the age of 13, he committed a crime. He went into a Little Caesars Pizza with a toy gun, got scared and ran out. He was sent in there by strangers that he owed money to. So he was the one that was caught for that crime. And yes, there were victims, and I understand the importance of looking at that. But at the age of 13, he was given a blended sentence. And what that meant was the judge gave him one last opportunity to complete a program. And if he didn't do that successfully, then he would be sent into the Michigan Department of Corrections. So he was sent to Iowa to a program that said right on their papers that they don't take youth with bipolar. He made it there 7 months in that program and was brought back and entered the Michigan Department of Corrections at the age of 15. This was the day that we showed up for his sentencing, along with the Battle Creek Enquirer. His case was published widely in the news. Even at the age of 13, his information was released, and it was very horrific. So we showed up. We knew we hadn't been able to have visits, but we didn't know why. The jail was not communicating with us what was going on. And here you can see he's in a Bam Bam suit. He had been slitting his wrists and was in the hole and had lost 20 pounds in the 2 weeks that he was there. The judge said that day to us that he would receive the mental health help he needed inside the prison system. But once he got inside the system, we learned that in fact the mental health help that was needed was not there. This is a photographer that has done some amazing work around the country regarding our juveniles. So he went inside the Lapeer prison system where the youth are supposed to go. And what we learned there was that there are no separate policies for the juveniles in our adult prison system. There are no inpatient mental health services for these juveniles. So after 7 months and he deteriorated, he was then sent into the inpatient psychiatric men's facility. At that time it was Huron Valley, and that is now the women's prison. Once he was moved in with the adults, he started begging me to assist these other youth that he was seeing in the same situation as himself. They were placed in isolation for safety purposes. So they were isolated, very much alone, yet they could see and hear everything that was going on around them. And the letter on the left is from one of the youth that he asked me to help and to get his family educated on becoming advocates. He had the mentality of a 6-year-old and was 14 years old at the time when he wrote this letter. The young man on the right sent a letter out to us, age 16. He had been moved into the mental health treatment program at one of the prisons, yet he was being caged, kept in cell, only 1 hour out a day alone in an outside yard. So he wasn't getting the groups and the therapy needed, again, because they were working to keep him safe while he was at the facility. What my son and all of these other young people saw and experienced inside the adult inpatient setting, no youth should ever have to see or experience. Here's another one of the youth that we assisted and assisted his family, teaching them how to advocate. So I'm here today because I really want to get the message out and to educate everyone to the fact that our system, our prison system, is not equipped to deal with the most significant mentally ill people here in Michigan. They don't have the training. They often don't have the way to manage these people. And so I'm going to share with you today the truths of what I learned and what has driven me to do this work. My son asked me to start reaching out and to look for organizations, and I did that, and I wound up here across the street in 2008 at a rally in memory of Timothy Souders. And this is a mentally ill inmate who died in 2006 after 72 hours of being restrained. Some of you may have seen the documentary on 60 Minutes regarding his story. And then there was Jeffrey Clark, who died in 2002 from his water being shut off. So he died from dehydration. Again, very schizophrenic. And I learned of Mr. McManus in the upper right-hand corner, who was in a prison in the UP, who simply quit eating, and he died from starvation. And that photograph came out of the Michigan Department of Corrections records. And then what I feared most happened next. My son wound up in long-term segregation due to his continual deterioration and more tickets. He was sent to Ionia. He was off from his medications, and I knew that he wasn't going to choose life. And I began to advocate more, and I was told that they no longer use 4- and 5-point restraints inside of our prison, yet I knew what he was describing. So I did Freedom of Information Act, and I was able to get out the photographs of his treatment in the lower right-hand corner. He was banging his head on the wall. And so, again, pointing to the fact that we don't have the means or the mechanisms within our prison system to really care for these people or provide the treatment that they need. And then I also met the family of Charlie Lane, and I like to tell his story because he was a veteran. He served in the Gulf War, and he became mentally ill after serving in the war. He was discharged from the military dishonorably, even though they knew he had a mental illness, and he came back to Michigan, and he was schizophrenic. He began committing crimes. He wound up in our prison system. He was in the mental health unit at one of the prison systems, and I met his parents. And they were sharing with me that he had actually bitten off the ends of 2 fingers. He gouged out one of his own eyes. They received a phone call that he was in a coma, that they didn't expect him to live 3 days. They got him to an outside hospital, and there the doctors discovered that he had been given Haldol, which was in his records that he was allergic to. So they got him off the Haldol. He began to get better. The parole board woke up and said, "What is this person doing inside of our prison system?" And they moved him to an outside psychiatric facility in the community. He is out today. He still suffers greatly from post-traumatic stress disorder, but he is out and living amongst us in our community. All of this led me to organizing families, letter writing campaigns, bringing awareness, and beginning Citizens for Prison Reform, where we assist families with their loved ones and teaching them how to advocate. So I want to look at some of the facts now about inside of our prisons. In 2010, University of Michigan did a study that found more than 20% of the state's prisoners, about 10,000 of inmates out of the population of 45,000, had severe mental disabilities. And that same study found that 65% of the 10,000 with severe mental disabilities had received no treatment in the last 12 months. Pretty significant. Some other facts that I would like to share with you is that there's only one recipient rights, a mental health specialist for the entire prison system. And for the jails, there are no mental health recipient rights specialists. Many of the prisoners are unable to conform to the department's rules, so they wind up with more and more tickets, more and more loss of privileges, which means they're spending more time in their cell, and then this often leads them to winding up in long-term segregation. The mentally ill prisoners who leave the inpatient psychiatric units, which at the women's prison that is within Huron Valley, there's only one women's prison in Michigan. For the men, it's Woodland Correctional Facility now is the inpatient. Once they leave that facility, they can no longer receive medication as needed. So if they're beginning to have a breakdown or a crisis, they cannot be given PRN medications. Often, as Dr. Kubiak mentioned, placement in segregation leads to further deterioration and further acting out. And then what we know is that the system is run by custody and security. And so then for them to manage these prisoners, often what they do is rely on water restriction, electricity restriction, paper, withholding other items, restraints, chemicals, and yes, in Michigan, we still hog tie human beings, something that's very concerning to me. The other thing that I want to mention as well, that was mentioned during one of the other presentations, is that we see frequently those with significant mental illness, they end up with more felony charges. My son was one of them, and I've seen it with most of the people that I have shared stories about today. In 2012, Michigan made the news in Solitary Watch, and some significant information finding that many of these prisoners end up among the 1,000 or so that are held in administrative segregation in Michigan. And that MDOC administration acknowledges that the percentage of prisoners with mental illness is probably higher than the overall population. Now, I believe the numbers may be lower today than 1,000 that we have held in segregation here in Michigan, but I still believe it's far too high, and far too many of them have significant mental illness. The other thing that I think we need to fully recognize is that when people with significant mental illness wind up in this system, what we saw was often families end up disappearing and becoming disconnected. Some of that's because they're simply worn out and tired. But what we saw was once my son entered the units where the mental health prisoners were held, there were very few of those prisoners that received visits. And the more that the prisoners end up locked down, losing phone privileges, end up in segregation, where the visits may be very short, very difficult because they're through glass, families often become more and more disconnected, and they don't know how to navigate or get through the system or even get the information. Some of them don't even understand that their loved one has a mental illness and that they're in the inpatient psychiatric prison. We found that during visits. And so it becomes a huge barrier for families to stay involved and to advocate. And that all of this led me to applying for a Soros Fellowship and beginning the Family Participation Program, where I have resource guides and information available, and I assist families in teaching them how to do this advocacy work in caring for their loved ones. I'm going to add just a couple of pieces. I really don't have anything in here regarding reentry, but I want to share just a little bit about the difficulties and what we experienced for those, my own son re-entering the system. So at the last facility my son was at in Macomb, they said, you've been on these meds for 10 years, you've never gotten better. They put him on a new med that wasn't even on their formulary, which is just amazing. And so I do want to point out that there are some fabulous staff. There are staff that we saw that are doing incredible work on the inside, but they're far and few between. So these staff got him on new beds, and he began to get better. And his cutting that he was doing and the destruction of property and the rages stopped. And they got him out of his cell, into treatment, into programming. And so that was amazing. And so he's now been out for 2.5 years. But when he came out, community mental health denied taking him as a patient, saying he was not severe enough. So I think we still have a lot of barriers within our community. I then proceeded to call 13 psychiatrists trying to find a doctor who would take him, and 5 of them said he was too severe, he needed more intensive treatment than they could provide, and the rest either didn't take insurance or weren't taking patients. So there are still many barriers that we have as we return these people to our communities. And I think that we need to fully understand that how they are treated on the inside, or the lack of treatment, really leads to the post-traumatic stress disorder that they deal with when they come out. And we need to remember that 95 to 98% of all of those who are inside will come out, even those with severe mental illness. And so we really need to work on making sure that, number one, we try to keep them out and divert them through the mental health courts and the diversion, that we're getting them the treatment that they need. But number two, we need to make sure that we have adequate training and really better mental health care on the inside for those who are in. Thank you so much.
a zillion questions, but I'm sure you have some as well. Would you like to kick it off over here?
My name is Margaret Keeler, and I'm with National Alliance on Mental Illness. NAMI is the largest grassroots organization dedicated to helping families and individuals with mental illness. It is an organization that is present across the state in many communities, not very well known oftentimes. We've been around in Lansing since, the roots of our organization started in 1974. We do have programs for families and individuals with mental illness, and one of the things that we really want to do more of is really reaching out to the courts and to the police departments to help them understand mental illness better, and also help them to understand that we have resources that are free. We do programming that is really important. But I think that I just wanted to make that comment, and I appreciate the opportunity to do that. Thank you.
Hi, this question is first for Candace Shields. With respect to my position, which is law enforcement, I'm a detective sergeant and in charge of now investigating crimes proactively, in a sense, for behavioral threat assessment at Michigan State. So with respect to my experience with the forensic centers, one of the difficulties in the last year has been that we are no longer able to refer misdemeanor cases. And that's contradictory to my efforts or what we're trying to do, and I'm very confused about whether I'm a police officer or a social worker anymore, but hopefully the two merge together very nicely, and our efforts to try to not see those persons with the serious crimes not just attended to, but to divert them. And mental health courts have helped a lot because they'll take on the misdemeanor cases, but in the long run or overall, what do you see as a remedy for us other than community mental health, which most of these youngsters will not voluntarily go to, and we're without an ability.
Well, and you just said youngsters, so we're talking about adults, correct?
We are, but I'm older, so these students are
Okay,
Michigan
okay.
State, right? So
Because
young adults.
we
They're
do
youngsters to me.
evaluate adults.
Right.
And yes and no on the misdemeanors, and here's the thing. If you read the statutory language, a person can put forth an insanity defense on felony cases, okay? So anyone with a misdemeanor, any level of crime, can be referred for pretrial competencies. Now, we do get referrals to evaluate people for criminal responsibility on misdemeanor cases. Here's the thing, those are generally, the maximum sentence would be 1 year. So a couple of things. We've got a lot of work to do, and those evaluations take a long time. So we do send out a letter that states that we're not going to be doing this. However, the judge can insist at any level that we do an evaluation. The thing, if you think about it though, like I said, we have indeterminate sentencing if someone's successful on an insanity plea. So by the time they actually get through the process, honestly, if you're looking at a 1-year misdemeanor case, they've actually sat in jail probably longer than the maximum sentence before we even get the evaluation completed with the information that we need to get them back to the court. So there's kind of some of the logic from our end, or, but if the judge or someone pushes the motion, we can do those on misdemeanor cases. And we do them on high misdemeanor cases, 2 years and above. But logically, usually defendants have probably pled out or done something before that evaluation is completed. So I thank you for that question.
And I do understand that. It's just
Yeah.
difficult when we're trying to prevent and to not have them escalate with the misdemeanor offenses or accumulate more or then go to the felony level.
Right.
Right.
So
And
know
I-
that if there's an insistence, we absolutely will do those at the misdemeanor level.
And I did have one hopeful question for maybe everyone here to consider or think with law enforcement and 2 years of this new experience of law enforcement and working in the system. One of the great difficulties is the HIPAA information, and I was hopeful someone would take on a challenge that would meet an understanding that law enforcement needs an emergency exception to HIPAA. In the sense of these youngsters, for me anyway, these young adults and persons that we come into contact with, when we're trying to connect the family and even information, some of them from out of state where we are, with their person of concern and their child in the medical facility, and I don't have an ability to, other than show up in uniform and demand and stand and persist, to ask even the question, are they safe, quote unquote. But it's a great difficulty that I'm asking anyone here that would help us try to resolve or look for a future of resolving that, to some exception for law enforcement to have information or access to that, even if it's to a doctor or some medical treatment facility for a person we come into contact with on the streets that we don't want to arrest. We have a lot of limits, and it's really HIPAA based, if that means anything to anyone here.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a clarifying, is it HIPAA or FERPA?
FERPA doesn't affect us in the streets in the sense of law enforcement is not an academic record. So that's not an issue for me. I can release information to family and things because of safety, quote unquote.
Okay.
So I have, outside of FERPA, it is HIPAA. It is calling the hospitals or anywhere to try to find out if their son or daughter is actually in the facility, so I can tell them, or if we have missing persons and they're hospitalized, and we have parents and family, and we're trying to connect, and it is a roadblock, to say the least.
Can you clarify, Dr. Shields, there's an insanity plea, but there's also incompetency. So incompetent to stand trial, or the insanity plea? I'm getting those two confused.
Yeah, so the distinction is that competence to stand trial is going to come before a trial is even set. And that is kind of a here and now issue. We're evaluating someone's mental condition, that's the lawful language, that's wide open. We all have a mental condition, so I'm going to evaluate that person's mental condition as to whether or not they understand the court proceedings now and can assist their attorney, whether or not they're ready to go back to court, okay? Because we don't want to send people who don't understand that or can't assist in their own defense back to court. It gets right back at, grassroots of fundamental fairness of our judicial system. We want reliable adjudications. I could go on and on. So the distinction now is that once someone's incompetent to stand, or competent to stand trial, incompetent or competent, that's a here and now issue. When we are evaluating someone's insanity or criminal responsibility, it's retrospective. It is at the time of the commission of a crime. Say 3 months ago, someone stabbed another individual. I am evaluating today what their mental state was at that time. And again, we have the same problems getting records for that information. But I'm going to take a look at that. Police records, psychiatric records. Were they hospitalized around that time? Were they off their medications? I mean, was there an issue at all? Because I didn't get to this, but we have threshold issues. The two things we evaluate first, did they have a mental illness, which is defined by our statutes. So when we talk about mental illness in general, we talk about it in general, but we have to stick to a statutory guideline. Or did they have an intellectual disability at that time? If my opinion is yes, then the next step is, did they lack substantial appreciation for what they were doing, or the consequences, or that their actions were wrong, or were they unable to control their behavior at the time? So that is a there and then type of evaluation. So one is going to occur before the trial even begins, and then I'm going to evaluate someone, and if the opinion indicates that yes, they have an opinion that somebody was legally insane at the time, then a defense attorney and that defendant may choose to enter that as a plea. I'm entering the plea, Your Honor, of not guilty by reason of insanity. Does that help? Okay.
You referred to someone having completed a year sentence
possibly in jail before you got to evaluate them for competency. What is the average length of time someone waits and when they're not out on bond, so they would be in jail and presumably mentally ill enough that there's a question about their competency before you're able to make that evaluation?
That's a really good question, and I can't put a number on the average time. But I mean, the process is they get a. I'll talk about someone who is in jail, and of course, people with mental illnesses are getting arrested and put in jail while they're charged for a crime. Well, then they have to go to their arraignment, and that's probably where they're going to be referred for an evaluation of competence to stand trial. I will tell you at the Forensic Center, we have made great strides in being able to decrease our time needed to complete that evaluation. I'm very excited about that with the resources that we have. We all talk about resources, and we've got what we've got. So there's that time to get them scheduled, get them seen by us, and then there could be time needed to get more information that we need for our evaluation. So some of the time lags are getting those records. We might be waiting on critical collateral information. So yes, this person is returned to jail. And generally, when someone's referred for competence to stand trial, their proceedings are stayed. They're kind of stopped. And usually bond is not even considered until the judge gets our report back to see whether or not what the determination is on their competency. So then once we get the report back to the court, per statute, they're supposed to have 5 days to get a hearing together. That doesn't always happen because of court dockets as well too. So you've got that time frame, and then, if they don't make bond or they're not awarded bond, they're going to remain in jail until their trial ensues. And so, that's beyond kind of us, but just to get you the process. So say someone's, got a one-year misdemeanor that they're facing. They very much that process could take up a lot of that time, if not more. And especially if we are doing a criminal responsibility evaluation, that is a much more comprehensive evaluation. It's retrospective, and it takes more time. We have to get more records, more information, talk to law enforcement officers that were there at the time. They're a great resource for us. So that's where the time lags may come from. Does that help?
Yes, I mean, I wasn't doubting your efficiency, but just the fact that these people who have a mental illness severe enough that their competency is in question are then left in the jails basically without treatment for that period of time.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we do triage. If our opinion is that someone's incompetent to stand trial, we, as much as possible, try to triage those cases and get those reports back to the court, because we know that they need, particularly if they're out on bond, not getting treatment. In the jail, they are generally getting some treatment. So if someone's out on bond and they're not getting treatment, we want to get them to where they're going to get treatment for their mental illness and get back on the road. In our case, for restoration of confidence, which is ameliorating that mental condition.
Now, regarding policy, Dr. Kubiak, you had talked about the in-reach sessions not being funded by Medicaid. And so when someone is imprisoned, although they may have a mental health problem, they're not getting treatment inside, right? Or
It's more an issue of connecting with resources outside, particularly for people who are in short-term incarceration in jail settings. So lots of times people will cycle in and out of the jail. And what the research tells us is it takes 8 contacts before someone will actually show up to a community mental health center for treatment. And so if we think about someone being released from jail without any of those contacts, then they're in the wind. And so if we could try to do some of that in-reach into the jails before someone's released, we may facilitate a shortening of that time to treatment, which is really important.
Now, I'm trying to figure out, okay, if it's not paid by Medicaid, is it generally paid by health insurance or private funds?
Right
Family
now, if a
support.
community mental health person is doing this, it's just coming out of their own, there is no reimbursement for it. So, you know, if they get a grant to do it, a grant will cover it. Some of the diversion funds are being used that way, but so many do not do it because it is not cost effective.
Okay. So once they're released, and you had said that they often need treatment once they're released. And so where do they get the help then?
If someone's on medication when they're in the jail, they're given a script for a medication refill, and then usually a referral to community mental health for a next appointment. And it's often we talk about that as being discharge planning, but for even those of us who do not have a mental health problem, taking that step to actually get the treatment is often difficult. And so we talk about that they have those pieces of paper, but executing that is often problematic. Especially when you leave the jail in many counties, it's a bus ticket you get. And if you know, you don't have housing and you don't have a job and you don't have all those other life supports, it's really difficult to think about, oh, I've got to get to the community mental health provider. So I think it's just trying to increase those connections.
Well, I really appreciate all your presentations. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis, I mean, when we talk about diverting people from the criminal justice system, we're already way downstream. There's already been some kind of tragedy. Some terrible thing has happened. And, you know, we've heard these cases, and I've experienced it in my family. My son's currently in this process right now. He's been found incompetent, had 7 months at the state hospital to be restored to competency, and then by the time the delay before it comes to trial, then no longer competent by the time it comes up again, and then back again to the forensic center. So the resources aren't available at the front end. You know, so community health is, mental health is turning away many, many people who then subsequently end up in this much more expensive, much more restrictive, less treatment. I mean, the jail tried to get my son hospitalized immediately when he got there, and it was denied. So how do we deal with that hurdle? And what is the cost-benefit analysis of the failure to have the community mental health services in place that thrusts people into the criminal justice system?
That is the big question, the big dilemma right there.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, some of the slides that show the, you know, the changing of the beds, the hospital patients versus the mentally ill in prison, I think are some kind of a cost benefit, not a dollar one, but certainly of lives. And I do agree that, you know, for many, community mental health is like the system of last resort. It's for severe, persistent in most communities. In some communities, it's the only provider in town, and then they will see across a broader range. But we know that if you're on Medicaid or you have an HMO, you usually have 20 mental health sessions, period, or a $2,000 cap, until you can prove you're severe or persistently mentally ill. And so it's trying to get mental illness thought about as a chronic condition, a chronic health condition for both our, you know, our public healthcare providers as well as private ones, and increasing those personal resources, I think, as well as the community resources.
talking about mental health courts, and it's my understanding that there are quite a few limitations on who may be eligible to go to a mental health court. And those who aren't eligible but are not found to be, have been legally insane at the time of their crime are going to wind up in prison most of the time. Or possibly they might be out on bond. But what are the restrictions on eligibility for the mental health court or substance abuse court?
There are no two mental health courts that are exactly alike. So the counties that the courts are derived from choose their eligibility based on what the problems are in that community. So for instance, St. Clair County has a mental health court that treats those who have primarily developmental disabilities and all misdemeanor offenses. Wayne County's mental health court is for those who've had probation failures or failures to comply with medication. And so they're more severe in terms of their criminal justice eligibility, but it's not a one-size-fits-all in any community. And so I do think that for me in the evaluation, some of the caveats around kind of the burgeoning rush to mental health courts are that we found that for those who have low-level crimes, particularly misdemeanors, they ended up spending more time in jail, either during the court or after the court. And again, I think that well-meaning judges were protective in trying to keep people from using substances and would lock them up for a few days. Or if they didn't comply with the whole court, they would consider them unsuccessful and then incarcerate them for the duration of their original sentence. So I think we have to be careful. Those who had more serious offenses, we found real reductions in the jail bed days and incarceration and recidivism later. Sometimes it was an inverse effect for those who had less serious crimes. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Sandy, or not, but...
Do any of them take like a serious assaultive offenses? I mean, people who have been charged with serious assaultive offenses? For example.
There are
This
few...
needs to be the last question.
Yes. There are few mental health courts that will consider someone who has a violent offense. Some will look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Well, we've identified areas where more research is needed, most definitely. And we've also identified that more resources are needed. There are policy changes that are needed. But I'm wondering if there is a central source for our audience to get a grasp, a better grasp of what those are specifically. Is there some central place they can go to look at what they would be talking with their legislator about regarding changes in our mental health system and how we manage people who are perhaps mentally ill and imprisoned? And it's very difficult to find because I really searched this out, and I went to NAMI and several other places and did not find that kind of information. I like to prepare something at the onset of the forum to get people in the state of mind where they're thinking about the issue. And I found the resources really slim.
Well, there's so many pieces to the puzzle. To say one, I don't know if you would agree, but to say one source, and we've talked about 3 pieces of that puzzle.
Yes.
So I am at a loss for one
I do think
source.
that the Gaines Center has done a lot of work on this intersection, both research and public policy advocacy. So I think they're a really good resource. The Bazelon Family Law Project is another one, NAMI certainly. But I think that those 3, and then there's the Center for Justice Advocacy that's done national work looking at the issue of mental illness in jails. I think are some, I guess, starting points. They're not, all inclusive, but I think will give you some good numbers and some data and some resources.
Very good. We can look up those links and post those to our website as a resource following this form. Okay. All right. Well, I thank you so much for not only your time here, but your work in this area and obviously your passion. I'd like to at least give each one of our panelists an opportunity to maybe prioritize one thing that they would put at the top of their list as needing and what you might talk with your local officials about, or just a closing statement, something that maybe you thought of during your presentation or during our questions here that you would like for people to leave with and to be thinking about, maybe sharing with their colleagues. Who gets the short straw?
Well, I can think of a lot, but I think that prevention and resources so that community, families in the community don't feel like law enforcement has to be their avenue for help. And I do think that many families get into that situation where they don't feel like there's the resources in the community, and so law enforcement is the place they turn. And while we can change some of those systems and prevent those, I hope we prevent it further on down the pike.
Thank you.
I'll piggyback on that, you know, particularly with the work that we do at the Forensic Center, we're always in need of more secure facilities or available facilities in the community. Some of our patients don't necessarily have to be in a maximum security psychiatric facility at the Forensic Center, but our options in the community are limited. So, you know, to say that we need more beds at the Forensic Center as well, we need options. And, you know, if, as Dr. Kubiak had talked, if we could intervene at that first level, even with law enforcement, and they have the resources to take that individual, the knowledge and the resources to take that individual and divert them from just jail, because they don't have the resources either. And I think that's the place we closed all of these facilities years ago and really set up nothing in the community, not nothing, but limited resources in the community to house all of those people, and now they're in our jails and prisons.
Thank you.
So I certainly would agree what both of them have spoken to. One of the things that I am seeing in the community that I feel is very successful that we need to rely on more, because we don't have enough police force and they aren't able or equipped to be able to handle all of these mental health crises. I think peer-to-peer supports, having more of those developed within our communities and seeing it more as a community-driven type of program where our local people are going to become involved in working to help those who have mental illness become stable. I think that is one of the things I would like to see. And certainly there's a lack of beds and places for people to go. I personally believe long-term that we need to get those who have significant mental illness out of the prisons. It is not the right setting for them. They do not have the ability to care for them. They are custody and security driven. Therefore, they will never get the person-centered treatment that they deserve by mental health code. And so that's one thing. Short term, I certainly hope here in Michigan that we will make a choice to stand loud and clear that our juveniles should not be entering into our adult prison system. They need to be in a separate facility. They are not adults in regards to their medical and mental health until they turn 18, yet we're sending them in with our adults. And horrific things are happening, and we need to put a stop to that quickly.
Thank you. Could you help me thank our panelists? Very quickly, you have evaluation forms in your packet, so we appreciate those. This is the one of 4 forms that we do each year. The last one is scheduled for May 6th, and we're going to take a real turn and look at the proposal 1 in review. So May 5th is the vote for the Safe Roads Yes, the roads infrastructure proposal that we've all been hearing about in the news. And then May 6th, the next day, we're going to have some folks come in and reflect on what happened with that campaign and the proposal vote. It's quite a unique proposal or a unique request to the public, and we'd like to have those who are involved in it, reflect on what just happened and what that means for our roads and our infrastructure in the future in Michigan. So this is the sheet. It's yellow actually in your packet, so you got the colorful handout. For now, thank you. We really appreciate your being here and hope to see you in May.